Sir, please don't go today. The words came so suddenly, so softly, that at first Richard Blake thought he had imagined them. He stood frozen in the middle of his lavish kitchen, holding a steaming mug of black coffee, still wearing his pressed white shirt and silk tie, perfectly ready for the most important business meeting of the year. He turned slowly, his dark brows furrowing. Maria, his housemaid, stood near the counter, her hands nervously clutching the edge of her apron. Richard's first instinct was to dismiss her words as nonsense. After all, Maria was quiet, shy, and rarely spoke more than polite good morning or sir. Dinner is ready. But today, something was different. Excuse me? Richard asked, his deep voice breaking the silence. Maria swallowed hard, her throat visibly moving. I said, please don't go to your meeting today. Richard blinked, almost amused. What are you talking about? It's just a meeting. I have them every day. He set his mug down on the marble counter and crossed his arms, studying her like a man who had just been told a joke he didn't quite get. But Maria didn't smile. Her face was pale, her eyes wide, and for a moment, Richard could swear he saw fear, real, bone-deep fear, shining in them. Sir, I know it sounds strange, Maria said in a rush, her voice trembling now. But something bad will happen if you go. Please, I'm begging you, don't leave the house today. Richard's jaw tightened. Billionaires like him didn't cancel meetings. Ever. The room seemed unnaturally quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the expensive wall clock. Maria, he said after a long pause, you've worked here for 6 years. You've never said anything like this before. Why now? Maria's hands twisted in her apron. Because I had to, she whispered. Because I couldn't let you walk out that door without warning you. Richard stared at her, searching her face for a hint of a lie, some sign that this was just superstition or panic, but he found none. Instead, he saw something else, conviction. He leaned against the counter, suddenly curious. You do realize what you're saying, right? You want me to cancel a multi-million-dollar deal because you have a bad feeling. Maria nodded silently. Richard let out a small laugh and ran a hand through his dark hair. You're serious. Yes, sir. Her voice was quiet but firm now. Something about the way she said it, like a mother warning her child before he ran into danger, sent a strange shiver down Richard's spine. He was not a man easily scared. He had faced hostile takeovers, lawsuits, and ruthless competitors trying to destroy him. But never in his life had someone looked him straight in the eye and said, Don't go. Something bad will happen. Maria, he said slowly, do you know something I don't? Maria hesitated. Her silence spoke louder than words. That hesitation was enough to make Richard's mind start racing. What if she wasn't just being dramatic? What if this wasn't superstition? Could there really be a threat waiting for him at that meeting? He straightened, suddenly alert. Sit down, he said firmly. Tell me exactly why you don't want me to go. Maria froze for a moment, her face pale. Then she stepped forward cautiously and sat on the edge of the chair near the kitchen table, clutching her apron like a lifeline. Sir, she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper, I don't know how to explain this without sounding crazy. But last night, I got a phone call from my cousin. He works at the hotel where your meeting is scheduled. He said, She trailed off, looking down. He said, What? Richard pressed, his tone sharper now. Maria took a deep breath, then met his eyes. He said, He overheard 2 men talking about you, about the meeting. They were saying terrible things. They said today would be the day they taught Richard Blake a lesson. Richard's eyes narrowed. And you believe them? Maria nodded. I do. My cousin wouldn't lie to me. He sounded scared, sir. Really scared. That's why I had to warn you. I couldn't live with myself if something happened to you, and I stayed quiet. Richard said nothing for a long moment. He just stared at her, his mind working like a machine. The morning sun streamed through the tall glass windows, casting golden light on the kitchen floor, but somehow the room felt colder. Richard had been in business long enough to know that enemies were everywhere. Success came with a price. People envied him, hated him, wanted him to fail. But this was different. This wasn't just business rivalry. This sounded like a setup. He turned and looked out the window at the long driveway where his black Rolls Royce was already parked, waiting to take him to the meeting. "Maria," he said quietly, "do you know what you're asking me to do? You're asking me to trust you with millions of dollars on the line." "I know, sir," Maria said, her voice steady now. "But some things are more important than money." The words hit him harder than he expected. Richard Blake had spent his entire life believing money solved everything. But as he stood there, looking at Maria's trembling hands and earnest face, something inside him shifted. For the first time in years, Richard Blake, the man who thought he could control everything, felt powerless. And he hated that feeling. Richard Blake didn't cancel meetings. He didn't back down from deals. In the business world, he was known as a man who walked straight into storms while everyone else ran for cover. And yet here he was, standing motionless in the middle of his mansion's kitchen, staring at Maria like she had just told him the sky was falling. Her words echoed in his mind like a drumbeat. "Please don't go. Something bad will happen." He ran a hand across his jaw, his mind racing. He had worked too hard, fought too many battles, built too big an empire to let fear dictate his decisions. But this wasn't just fear. This was Maria. And Maria never spoke out of turn. Richard had always seen her as quiet, dependable, maybe even invisible sometimes. Someone who kept the house running without him ever having to think about it. But today, she had broken her silence, and her words carried a weight he couldn't ignore. "Do you realize how crazy this sounds?" Richard finally said, his tone softer now, but laced with disbelief. Maria nodded, lowering her eyes. "I do, sir, but I had to say something." Richard turned and started pacing the kitchen floor, his polished shoes clicking against the marble tiles. He felt torn between two worlds, the rational, business-minded billionaire who never let emotions get in the way, and the small but growing voice in the back of his mind telling him she might be right. He glanced at the clock. 8:45 a.m. The meeting was scheduled for 9:30 sharp. If he didn't leave soon, he'd be late, and Richard Blake was never late. He grabbed his phone and began typing out a message to his driver, telling him to get the car ready. But just before he hit send, his thumb froze over the screen. What if Maria was right? For the first time in years, Richard felt something he hadn't felt since his early days as a struggling entrepreneur: doubt. The last time he had felt this unsettled was the day his first company had nearly gone bankrupt. He had learned to trust his instincts back then, and right now, his instincts were screaming at him to stop and think. He turned back to Maria, who stood there silently, wringing her hands. "You know what you're asking me to do?" Richard said quietly. Maria nodded again. "I do, sir. I know I'm just a maid. I know I have no right to interfere in your business. But I couldn't live with myself if I stayed quiet and something happened to you today." Richard stared at her, feeling something unfamiliar rise in his chest, gratitude mixed with unease. He wasn't used to people worrying about him. His board of directors cared about profits, not his safety. His competitors would probably throw a party if something happened to him. Even his so-called friends only seemed to care about being invited to his mansion parties and sitting next to him at charity galas. But Maria's fear wasn't fake. She wasn't trying to manipulate him or win his favor. She was genuinely concerned, and that was what unsettled him most of all. "Maria," he said slowly, "you know I can't just cancel a meeting like this. There's too much at stake." "I know," Maria whispered, her voice cracking. "But what's at stake if you go and something bad happens? Money can be earned again, sir. But if you lose your life or your reputation, you can't get those back." Her words hung in the air like smoke. Richard turned away, walking toward the massive floor-to-ceiling window overlooking his perfectly manicured lawn. Outside, the gardener was trimming hedges, completely unaware of the battle happening inside the house. Richard pressed a hand to the cold glass. He had spent decades building this empire, Blake Industries. His name was on skyscrapers, luxury resorts, and tech companies across the globe. His competitors hated him because he was always 10 steps ahead. But what if today they had finally found a way to trap him? The thought sent a cold shiver down his spine. He glanced over his shoulder at Maria. She was still standing there, her face pale, but her back straight. She looked like a soldier waiting for a command. Richard walked back to the counter and poured himself another cup of coffee, more for something to do with his hands than because he needed it. "You've given me a lot to think about," he said finally, taking a sip. Maria opened her mouth to speak, then closed it again. She didn't push. Richard appreciated that. In a world full of people who shouted to get his attention, Maria's quiet warning had done more to stop him in his tracks than any corporate advisor ever could. He thought about the meeting again, who would be there, what they would discuss. It wasn't just a simple deal. This was about a major expansion into a new market. Billions were on the line. The press would be watching, waiting for a story. If something went wrong today, it wouldn't just cost him money. It could destroy his public image, send his stock prices crashing, and give his competitors the opening they had been waiting for. His stomach knotted. He set the coffee cup down with a loud clink. "Fine," he said abruptly, his voice cutting to the tension like a blade. "I won't go. Not yet." Maria's eyes widened. "You mean it?" "Yes," Richard said. "But I need to know exactly what's going on. I'm not staying home because of some bad feeling. I want proof." Maria nodded quickly. "Thank you, sir. I just didn't want you to walk into a trap." Richard looked at her for a long moment. For the first time, he didn't just see her as the maid. He saw her as someone who might have just saved him from disaster. But he still had questions. Why was this happening now? Who were those men? And most importantly, who wanted to hurt him badly enough to plan something like this? Richard's confusion hadn't gone away. If anything, it had deepened. But one thing was clear. This day was not going to go as planned. He straightened his tie, his expression hardening. "Maria," he said, his voice calm but commanding now, "tell me everything your cousin told you. Every single word. Don't leave anything out." Maria took a deep breath, preparing to reveal a secret that would set off a chain of events neither of them could have imagined. Richard Blake had faced boardroom wars, hostile takeovers, and journalists digging into his private life, but nothing had ever made him feel like this. For the rest of the morning, he couldn't shake Maria's words out of his mind. Even after she left the kitchen to continue her chores, Richard remained sitting at the table, staring at the untouched coffee cup in front of him. The world outside the window looked exactly the same: bright sunlight, the sound of birds, his luxury cars glinting in the driveway. Yet something felt wrong. It was as if a shadow had fallen over his perfect life. He grabbed his phone and scrolled through his calendar. The meeting was still there, highlighted in red. Hotel Orion, 9:30 a.m. He should have been getting into his car by now, reviewing last-minute notes, preparing to shake hands with the city's most powerful investors. Instead, he was sitting in silence, staring at the clock, listening to the tick-tick-tick of the second hand. He hated this feeling, this hesitation. Billionaires weren't supposed to hesitate. Richard was a man who thrived on certainty. He made quick decisions, took bold risks, and never second-guessed himself. That was how he had turned a failing family business into a global empire. People trusted him to be unshakable. But Maria's warning had cracked that armor. He stood and began pacing the length of the room, his polished shoes clicking softly on the marble floor. Each step echoed like a question in his mind. What if Maria was right? What if this wasn't just some Maid superstition, but a real threat? He grabbed his phone and opened a security app, checking the news. Nothing out of the ordinary. No threats, no scandals, no warnings. He scrolled through his emails, just contracts, updates from managers, and meeting reminders. Everything looked normal, and yet something deep inside him whispered that it wasn't. Richard had built his fortune partly by trusting his gut, and right now his gut told him to stop. Something about today wasn't safe. He walked over to the massive glass wall in his living room that overlooked the sprawling city skyline. Normally, he loved this view. It reminded him of how far he had come from his small, cramped childhood home. But today, the city looked different, colder, more dangerous. He could almost imagine shadowy figures moving in the distance, waiting for him to step into their trap. For a moment, Richard wondered if he was losing his mind. He had never been a man who believed in omens or intuition. Business was numbers, logic, strategy. You won by being smarter and faster than everyone else, not by listening to a maid's warnings. And yet, he couldn't shake the memory of Maria's face, her pale skin, the way her hands trembled, the quiet desperation in her voice. Maria wasn't a dramatic woman. She never got involved in his personal affairs. If she had spoken up today, it meant she truly believed something terrible was going to happen. Richard rubbed his temples, frustration bubbling inside him. He hated being caught between two choices: go and risk walking into a trap, or stay home and risk losing a major deal. For a man who always had answers, it felt unbearable not to know what to do. He poured himself another cup of coffee, but barely touched it. His mind kept drifting back to the meeting. He imagined walking into that hotel conference room, smiling at the investors, shaking hands. And then what? Would someone be waiting for him there? Would someone be hiding in the shadows, ready to record him, humiliate him, destroy everything he had built, or worse, hurt him? A chill ran down his spine. He remembered stories he had heard over the years about powerful businessmen getting trapped, rivals secretly recording conversations, splicing them out of context, and leaking them to the media. Careers ruined in a single day. If Maria's cousin had overheard something like that, then this wasn't just paranoia. This was a warning. Richard finally sat back down and grabbed a notepad. He started writing down names, all the people who would be at the meeting, all the rivals who might want to sabotage him, all the competitors who would benefit if Blake Industries collapsed. The list grew longer than he liked. It wasn't paranoia if you really did have enemies. He tapped his pen against the page, deep in thought. Then, almost without realizing it, he picked up his phone and called his assistant, James. "James," he said when the man answered. "The meeting at Hotel Ryan, I might not attend in person." There was a stunned pause on the other end. "Sir, did I hear that right? You're not going?" "Not yet," Richard said. "But I need you to be ready. If I decide to send you instead, I want you to carry a camera. Discreetly." "A camera?" James sounded confused. "Yes. I want to see exactly what happens in that room today. Every word, every face, every move." James hesitated, but didn't question him. "Understood, sir. I'll be ready." Richard hung up and leaned back in his chair. It wasn't much, but it was a plan. Still, the unease wouldn't go away. Even after making that decision, Richard found himself walking through the house restlessly, checking the time every few minutes. He stepped into his private office, looked at the framed awards on the wall, the polished shelves full of books about business strategy and leadership. Normally, this room gave him confidence. Today, it felt like a cage. His mind kept flashing back to Maria's voice. "Something bad will happen if you go." And the strangest part? He believed her. For a man who trusted no one, that realization was almost frightening. Richard stood in the middle of his office, hands in his pockets, staring at Maria. She stood by the door, clearly nervous, her shoulders tense. It wasn't often that she was called into this room, the heart of his empire, with its walls lined with awards, glossy photos of Richard shaking hands with presidents and CEOs, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline. This wasn't a conversation about cleaning schedules. Richard's tone was calm but sharp, the kind of tone that made even his most confident employees sit up straighter. "Maria," he said, "you have 30 seconds to tell me the full truth. No half answers, no guessing. If I'm going to take you seriously, if I'm going to risk missing the biggest deal of my year, I need to know why." Maria clutched her apron and nodded. "Yes, sir." She stepped closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "Last night, I got a phone call from my cousin, Raul. He works as a bellboy at the Orion Hotel, where your meeting is supposed to be held this morning. He was cleaning up one of the private lounges late at night when he overheard two men talking." Richard's jaw tightened. "What men?" "He didn't see their faces clearly," Maria admitted. "They were standing near the balcony, speaking in low voices. But he heard enough. One of them said, 'Tomorrow we finally teach Richard Blake a lesson.' The other laughed and said, 'He'll never see it coming. By the time the press gets what we're going to give them, Blake Industries will be bleeding.'" Richard's stomach turned. Maria continued, wringing her hands nervously. My cousin said they talk about setting up hidden microphones and cameras in the meeting room, the same room you were supposed to be in today. They mentioned that they didn't need you to say much, just enough to twist your words and make it look like you were admitting to illegal business deals. Richard felt his pulse hammering in his ears. He had been in enough negotiations to know how dangerous even a single out-of-context quote could be. A carefully edited video could ruin his reputation, tank his stock prices, and trigger government investigations, even if he had done nothing wrong. Maria's voice trembled as she continued. Raul said he wanted to warn you immediately, but he was scared. Those men didn't look like regular guests. He thought they might notice him. So he waited until he got home and called me. She swallowed hard, her eyes glistening. I didn't sleep all night, sir. I kept thinking, what if you went to that meeting and walked right into a trap? What if something happened to you because I stayed quiet? So this morning, I decided I had to tell you, even if you fired me for speaking out of turn. For a moment, Richard said nothing. He just stared at her, his mind spinning. It all made sense now. The fear in her eyes, the urgency in her voice. This wasn't superstition. This wasn't paranoia. This was a warning. And if what Maria said was true, someone out there wasn't just trying to embarrass him. They were trying to destroy him. Richard slowly walked over to his desk and placed his hands on the polished wood surface. Did Raul recognize their voices? Maria shook her head. No, sir, but he heard one of them mention a name. I think it was Harrison. Richard froze. Harrison. The name hit him like a thunderclap. Victor Harrison was one of his oldest rivals, a man who had tried and failed to buy Blake Industries 2 years ago, then launched his own competing firm to take Richard down. Victor had been desperate for leverage ever since. And now, maybe it found it. Richard's jaw tightened, his expression hardening into one of cold determination. Maria, he said, his voice low, do you realize what you may have just uncovered? If Victor Harrison is behind this, this isn't just about me. This is an attempt to manipulate the entire market. He could crash my company's value, buy up shares for cheap, and take control of everything I've built. Maria's eyes widened. I didn't think of that, sir. I just didn't want you to be hurt. Richard nodded slowly, his anger simmering beneath the surface. He had always known Victor was ruthless, but this was a declaration of war. For a moment, the room fell silent. The only sound was the faint ticking of the antique clock on the wall. Then Richard straightened and turned back to Maria. You did the right thing telling me this, he said finally. You may have just saved me and Blake Industries from disaster. Maria's shoulders sagged in relief, but she still looked anxious. What are you going to do, sir? Richard's lips curved into a grim smile. What I always do, I'm going to fight back. But this time, I'm going to do it smart. He grabbed his phone and dialed his assistant, James. James, he said when the man answered, change of plan. You're going to the meeting in my place with the hidden camera we discussed. I want everything recorded. If they try anything, I want proof. Yes, sir, James replied. Understood. Richard hung up and looked back at Maria. You did well, he said, his tone softened now. Most people wouldn't have had the courage to warn me. I won't forget that. Maria's face flushed, and she nodded silently. As she left the office, Richard turned back to the window, staring out at the glittering city below. Somewhere out there, Victor Harrison and his men thought they had outsmarted him, but they were about to find out what happened when you tried to trap Richard Blake. Richard Blake sat in his office long after Maria left, staring at the city skyline with a stillness that would have unnerved anyone who knew him well. He wasn't a man who hesitated. He was known for his decisiveness, a man who could close billion-dollar deals in minutes. But this time he didn't rush. This time, he let the silence fill the room as he thought. Maria's words replayed in his head. Raul's warning. The name Harrison. The thought of walking into that meeting and being recorded. His words twisted, his name dragged through the mud. His empire could crumble overnight. Richard rose to his feet and paced the length of the office, his mind racing. He had two options. Option 1, ignore Maria's warning, attend the meeting and hope she was wrong. Option 2, cancel the meeting and stay home. which would send a message to everyone that Richard Blake was scared. That was not an image he wanted the world to see. But then a third option slowly formed his mind. An option that felt risky, bold, and very much like him. He stopped pacing and glanced at the family portrait on the wall. His late father, a stern man who had taught him that business was war, and that you never let your enemies strike first. Richard clenched his jaw. No, he wasn't going to sit here hiding like a coward. He was going to fight back, but not recklessly. If Harrison really had planted people in that hotel to set him up, then Richard needed evidence, undeniable, irrefutable proof, that he was being targeted. That was when he made the decision. He wouldn't go to the meeting in person, but the meeting would still happen, with his assistant James there in his place, carrying a hidden camera and microphone. Richard grabbed his phone and called James again. "James," he said, his voice calm but firm, "listen carefully. You're going to the Orion Hotel exactly on schedule. You're going to sit in my chair, take my place, and act as though everything is normal." James hesitated. "Sir, won't they notice I'm not you?" Richard allowed a small smirk. "They'll notice, and that's the point. If Harrison's men are there, they'll panic. They'll try to figure out what went wrong, and we'll catch them on camera. I want you to be polite, calm, and professional, but keep your eyes and ears open. Record everything. If anything feels wrong, leave immediately and call me." James nodded on the other end of the line. "Understood, sir. I'll handle it." After hanging up, Richard leaned back in his chair and let out a slow breath. The decision had been made, and with it came a strange sense of clarity. He wasn't running from the fight. He was taking control of it. But deep down, he couldn't ignore the uneasy feeling in his gut. If Harrison had gone this far, he wouldn't stop just because Richard sent someone else in his place. This plot wasn't about Richard's physical presence. It was about his company, his reputation, his entire legacy. This could be bigger than just one meeting. Richard walked to the bar cart in the corner of the room, poured himself a glass of water, and stared at his reflection in the mirror above the shelves. The man staring back at him looked calm, almost cold, but his mind was a storm. He thought about everything he had built. The skyscrapers, the investments, the thousands of employees whose livelihoods depended on him. If Harrison succeeded, they wouldn't just take him down. They would take everyone down. No, he wouldn't let that happen. He pulled out his phone again, this time calling his head of security. "Ethan," Richard said when the man answered, "I want a full sweep of the Orion Hotel. Discreetly. Check for hidden cameras, recording devices, anything suspicious. I want to know exactly what's in that meeting room before James even sits down." "Yes, sir," Ethan replied immediately. "I'll have a team there in 20 minutes. "Good," Richard said, ending the call. For a moment, he stood there in the quiet room, the weight of the decision pressing on his shoulders. He wasn't afraid of confrontation. He was afraid of being caught unprepared. And now, thanks to Maria, he wouldn't be. Richard picked up the framed photo of his father again, running a finger along the edge of the frame. "You always told me to stay 3 steps ahead," he murmured. "Well, Dad, today I'm going to stay 10 steps ahead." He set the photo down and turned back to his desk. He sent a message to his legal team, letting them know to be on standby. If he caught Harrison red-handed, there would be lawsuits, press releases, and possibly criminal charges. The thought of watching Harrison squirm in front of a judge brought a grim smile to Richard's face. But then, unexpectedly, his thoughts returned to Maria. He pictured her standing in his kitchen that morning, her hands shaking as she begged him not to go. If he had ignored her warning, he would probably be in a hotel conference room right now, unknowingly walking into Harrison's trap. The thought made his chest tighten. Maria had risked her job, her comfort, and possibly her cousin's safety to protect him. He wasn't used to people doing things for him out of loyalty, not without expecting something in return. And that made her warning mean even more. Richard made a mental note to speak to Maria again later. Not as her boss, but as a man who owed her a debt of gratitude. For now, though, there was work to be done. The clock ticked closer to 9:30 a.m. Richard sat down at his desk, opened his laptop, and prepared to watch the live feed from James's hidden camera. The plan was in motion. All he had to do now was wait, and be ready for whatever the next hour would bring. The clock on Richard Blake's desk read 9:15 a.m. The Orion Hotel was a 20-minute drive from his mansion, and James was already on the way. Richard sat in his office, his laptop open, waiting for the live feed from the hidden camera to start streaming. He had chosen James carefully years ago, a quiet, observant man who never panicked under pressure. If anyone could pull this off without tipping their hand, it was him. But still, Richard's jaw was tense. He hated sitting still while someone else walked into danger. On his screen, the feed blinked to life. James was sitting in the back seat of the black company car, his phone resting casually on his lap. The camera gave Richard a perfect view of everything in front of James, from the car interior to the road ahead. "Are you ready?" Richard asked over the earpiece. James's calm voice came back immediately. "Yes, sir. I'll act as though nothing is wrong." Richard leaned back in his chair, but didn't relax. His fingers tapped against the desk as the car approached the Orion Hotel. The hotel was a gleaming tower of glass and steel, one of the most luxurious in the city. Normally, Richard would have felt a surge of pride knowing his meeting was happening there. Today, it felt like enemy territory. James exited the car, walked confidently through the lobby, and approached the private conference room. The camera angle gave Richard a good look at the surroundings. Elegant chandeliers, marble floors, businessmen sipping coffee in the lounge. Everything looked normal. But Richard's instincts told him it wasn't. "Keep your eyes open," Richard murmured. "Always do," James replied. The conference room door opened, and James stepped inside. Richard's heart rate picked up as he watched the scene unfold. Several investors were already seated at the polished mahogany table. Some of them glanced up in surprise when they saw James instead of Richard. "Mr. Blake couldn't be here today." James said smoothly, taking a seat. "He sends his apologies and has asked me to represent him." The investors nodded politely, though Richard noticed a few exchanged glances. Glances that made his gut tighten. Then it happened. Two men entered the room quietly, wearing dark suits and carrying slim briefcases. They didn't sit down immediately. Instead, they stood near the back, whispering to each other. The hidden microphone picked up fragments of their conversation. "Not him," one hissed. "Blake's not here," the other whispered sharply. "This changes everything. What do we do?" Richard's grip on the armrest tightened. They were there. Maria had been right. James stayed calm, pretending not to notice, but subtly angled the briefcase so the camera had a clear view of the men's faces. "Stay put," Richard whispered through the earpiece. "I want to hear what they do next." The men finally sat down, pretending to be ordinary attendees, but their body language was tense. One of them reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small device, placing it under the table. Richard leaned forward, narrowing his eyes. A bug. They were planting recording devices. Rage simmered in his chest, but he forced himself to stay calm. He needed them to keep going. The more evidence they gave him, the stronger his case would be. On the feed, the meeting began. One of the senior investors started discussing projections and upcoming contracts. James took notes, asking polite questions, but his hands never strayed far from the hidden microphone controls. Every few minutes, the two suspicious men whispered to each other. "He was supposed to be here. This isn't going to work. Do we abort? Wait. Maybe we can still get something." Richard's jaw clenched. This was more than just corporate espionage. This was a trap. If they could get James to say something careless, they would still try to twist it and use it against Blake Industries. And then came the moment that made Richard's blood run cold. One of the men pulled out a phone and sent a message. The screen lit up just long enough for the camera to catch the name on the message thread. Victor Harrison. Richard froze. There it was, the proof he had been waiting for. Harrison was behind this. Richard's calm mask slipped for just a moment as he let out a sharp breath. He had suspected Harrison, but seeing his name there, in the middle of this plot, made everything real. "James," Richard said to gritted teeth, "finish the meeting as quickly as possible. Don't let them get anything useful out of you. When you're done, leave immediately and wait for my call." "Understood," James replied, his tone even. Richard switched to another line and called Ethan, his head of security. "Ethan," he said, his voice icy with focus, "those two men are in the Orion conference room right now. I have them on camera. I want them followed the moment they leave. I want to know where they go, who they report to, and every single person they meet today. Discreetly. No mistakes." "Yes, sir," Ethan said. "Consider it done." Richard hung up and turned back to the laptop screen. The meeting was wrapping up now, the investors shaking hands with James. The two men with the briefcases looked frustrated, whispering furiously to each other. One of them removed the device from under the table and slipped it back into his pocket, clearly realizing the plan had failed. James stood, gave a polite nod to the room, and walked out. Richard exhaled slowly, his shoulders finally relaxing for the first time all morning. He had them. He had caught them in the act, on camera, with Harrison's name connected to the plot. But this was just the beginning. Richard closed the laptop and stood, his expression hardening into a look that anyone who knew him would recognize, the look of a man preparing for war. "Maria," he called, his voice echoing through the mansion. A moment later, she appeared at the door, wiping her hands nervously on her apron. "Yes, sir?" Richard walked toward her, his steps deliberate. "You were right," he said simply. "And because you were right, we just stopped a disaster." Maria blinked, clearly surprised. "So, they really were planning something?" Richard nodded, his jaw tight. "Yes, and now I know exactly who's behind it, which means it's time to hit back." Maria hesitated, then asked softly, "What are you going to do, sir?" Richard's lips curled into a grim smile. "I'm going to make sure they never try this again." The air in Richard Blake's mansion was electric. Maria stood quietly in the corner, clutching her apron nervously, while Richard's security chief, Ethan, stood at attention near the desk, giving his report. "We followed the two men from the Orion Hotel as instructed," Ethan said, his tone professional but laced with a hint of excitement. "They went straight to Harrison's private office downtown. Stayed there 30 minutes. Then one of them made a call. We recorded it." Richard raised an eyebrow. "Play it." Ethan tapped a button on the small recorder. Harrison's voice came through, smooth and smug. "Did you get what we needed?" "No," one of the men replied. "Blake wasn't there. He sent someone else." A pause. Then Harrison's voice, sharper now, "Useless. If we can't catch Blake saying something we can use, we'll just have to make it up. Push the story to the press anyway. By the time he denies it, the damage will already be done." Richard's fist slammed against the desk, rattling the glass of water nearby. That was all the confirmation he needed. Harrison wasn't just trying to trap him. He was prepared to fabricate evidence and destroy Richard's reputation by any means necessary. Maria flinched at the sound, but Richard quickly steadied himself, exhaling slowly. "Thank you, Ethan," he said, calmer now but with steel in his voice. "This changes everything. We're not just defending ourselves anymore. We're going on the offensive." Maria glanced up timidly. "Sir, what does that mean?" Richard turned toward her, and for the first time, there was a flicker of something softer in his expression. Respect. "It means," he said, "we're going to show the world exactly who Harrison really is. But we have to do it carefully. One wrong move, and he'll spin the story against us." He turned back to Ethan. "I want every single one of Harrison's recent communications monitored. Phone calls, emails, private meetings. Get me a timeline of everything he's done in the last 3 months." Ethan nodded. "Already in motion, sir." Richard leaned against his desk, his mind racing. This wasn't just about Harrison anymore. This was about the principle. People like Harrison thought they could manipulate anyone, destroy anyone, as long as they had enough money and influence. But Richard had built his empire from nothing. He had fought for every contract, every partnership, every deal. And no one, not even Harrison, was going to take it from him. That night, Richard sat alone in his study, watching the city lights glitter in the distance. Maria had brought him dinner earlier, quietly setting the tray on the desk before slipping out of the room. He hadn't touched it. His mind was too focused. In front of him were files, background checks, financial records, and photographs of Harrison meeting with shady figures in parking lots and restaurants. Piece by piece, Richard was building a case, but it still wasn't enough. He needed something undeniable, something so big that when it came out, Harrison wouldn't just lose this game, he'd lose everything. Richard picked up his phone and called an old contact, a journalist he trusted. "Lydia," he said when she answered, "I might have a story for you, but you'll need to be patient. When I have everything, I'll give you the exclusive." The journalist's voice sharpened with interest. "How big are we talking?" Richard's lips curved into a cold smile. "Career-ending big." He hung up and turned back to files. The next morning, Richard called Maria into his office. She came in looking hesitant, as though expecting bad news. Instead, Richard surprised her by saying, "Maria, I owe you something." She blinked. "Sir, if you hadn't warned me, yesterday could have been the end of everything," he said, his tone unusually gentle. "I need you to know I don't take that lightly. You've earned my trust." Maria's eyes widened slightly. I just did what felt right." "And because you did," Richard said, "we have a chance to stop this before it destroys us." He paused and added, "But I need you to do one more thing for me." Maria nodded without hesitation. "Anything." Richard handed her a sealed envelope. "Give this to Raoul. Tell him to get me everything he can on Harrison, where he goes, who he meets, even the kind of coffee he drinks in the morning. If anyone in that building can get close to him without being noticed, it's Raoul." Maria took the envelope, her heart pounding. "Yes, sir. I'll make sure he gets it." By evening, Raoul had delivered hidden camera footage, bank statements, secret recordings of Harrison laughing about sabotaging competitors. Richard sat at his desk reviewing it all, his anger deepening with every file he opened. This wasn't just one plot. Harrison had been doing this to other companies for years, destroying people's lives to eliminate competition. Richard felt a cold determination settle over him. Tomorrow, he would make his move, but not before Harrison made one last mistake. At exactly 8 p.m., Richard received a message on his phone, an anonymous tip saying Harrison was meeting with a group of reporters at a private restaurant, planning to leak the false story about Richard first thing in the morning. Richard's eyes narrowed. Perfect. He grabbed his coat and headed out the door, Ethan and 2 security men falling in to step behind him. Maria watched him leave, her chest tight with worry. She had seen Richard angry before, but tonight there was something different in his eyes. Not just anger, but resolve. She whispered a quick prayer under her breath. "Please let him come back safe." Richard arrived at the restaurant and took a seat in a private booth where he could see everything without being seen. And there was Harrison, sitting at a corner table with 3 reporters, laughing as he passed them a folder. Richard's blood boiled, but he forced himself to stay calm. He discreetly tapped the earpiece he was wearing. "Are we recording?" Ethan's voice came back. "Loud and clear, sir." Every word Harrison spoke was being captured in crystal clarity. And then Harrison said it, the sentence that would end him. "Blake will deny it, of course," Harrison said with a smirk. "But by the time the denial hits the news, his stock will have tanked, and I'll have already bought the controlling shares. Then Blake Industries will be mine." Richard smiled, a slow, dangerous smile. He had just won. By the time Harrison left the restaurant, Richard already had the recording downloaded, backed up, and sent to his legal team and Lydia, the journalist. Tomorrow morning, the world would hear the truth, straight from Harrison's own mouth. And Richard Blake would not just survive this attack. He would come out stronger. The next morning, the world woke to chaos, but this time, it was chaos of Richard Blake's making. By 7 a.m., Lydia's article had gone live on every major news site. The headline blazed across phone screens and television broadcasts. Billionaire rival caught plotting corporate sabotage. Audio leaks rocked the business world. The story spread like wildfire. Inside the article was everything. The audio recording of Harrison plotting to destroy Blake Industries. Screenshots of bank transactions tying Harrison to shell companies used for smear campaigns. Video footage of his men planting recording devices under the table at the Orion Hotel. There was no room for denial. Social media exploded with outrage. Hashtag Blake Vindicated and hashtag expose Harrison, trended worldwide within hours. Richard sat in his office, calm but alert, watching the news coverage with Ethan and James at his side. On the screen, reporters played the recording again and again, letting the world hear Harrison's smug confession. Maria stood in the doorway, her hands clasped nervously. "Sir," she said softly, "everyone's talking about it. People are saying you're a hero for exposing this." Richard didn't smile. "Not yet. This isn't about being a hero," he said quietly. "This is about making sure no one ever tries this again." By mid-morning, Harrison's empire was already crumbling. Investors pulled out of his projects. His PR team released a weak statement claiming the recording was taken out of context, but no one believed it. By noon, Harrison himself was forced to call a press conference. Richard watched it live on his laptop. Harrison stepped up to the podium, looking pale and defeated. The confident, mocking tone was gone. I take full responsibility for what was said," Harrison began, sweat glistening on his forehead under the camera's harsh lights. "But I assure you, my remarks were never meant to." The reporters didn't let him finish. "Do you admit you tried to sabotage Richard Blake?" One shouted. "Did you pay men to spy on his company?" Another asked. Harrison stammered, denied, tried to spin the story. But every denial only made him look guiltier. Richard leaned back in his chair, finally allowing himself a small smile. Justice. Real, undeniable justice. But Richard wasn't done yet. Later that afternoon, he held his own press conference. Not out of revenge, but to make sure the truth was clear to the entire world. The media packed into the grand hall of Blake Industries headquarters. Cameras flashed, microphones jostled. Reporters shouted questions even before Richard took the podium. When he finally stepped up, the room went silent. He stood tall, dressed in a dark suit, every inch a commanding billionaire they all knew. But there was a new sharpness in his gaze. "Good afternoon," Richard said, his voice calm but carrying through the room. "As you all know by now, an attempt was made to destroy my company, my reputation, and the livelihood of thousands of people who work for Blake Industries. Today, that attempt has been exposed for what it really was. An illegal act of sabotage by Victor Harrison." The crowd buzzed with murmurs, cameras clicking furiously. Richard continued, his tone steady and resolute. "I did not come here to celebrate Harrison's downfall. I came here to make a promise. To my employees, to my partners, and to every honest business owner out there. Blake Industries will not be intimidated. We will not be manipulated. And we will not allow greed to destroy what so many people have worked so hard to build." The room erupted in applause. Reporters shouted questions, but Richard simply stepped back from the podium, letting his silence speak for itself. The image of him standing there, calm and unshaken, would be replayed on every news channel for days. Back at the mansion, Maria watched the press conference on the television in the kitchen, tears in her eyes. She had seen the fear on Richard's face 2 days ago when she first warned him not to go to that meeting. She had seen the weight he carried. And now, watching him stand in front of the world and turn the tables on Harrison, she felt an overwhelming sense of pride. Raul, who had come by to drop off more files, grinned at the screen. "Your boss just made history," he said. Maria smiled faintly. He didn't do it alone. Raul glanced at her, then nodded knowingly. No, he didn't. But for Richard, the battle wasn't quite over. Later that night, he received a call from his legal team. "Sir, the district attorney's office has reviewed the evidence," his lawyer said. "They're preparing criminal charges against Harrison. Wiretapping, fraud, attempted market manipulation. He could be facing serious prison time." Richard closed his eyes for a moment, letting the news sink in. He wasn't a vindictive man by nature. But this wasn't about revenge. This was about accountability. "Good," he said finally. "Make sure the evidence package is watertight. I don't want Harrison wriggling out of this on a technicality." The next morning, headlines screamed again, this time announcing Harrison's arrest. Cameras caught him being led out of his office in handcuffs, his face ashen, his once pristine suit rumpled. Social media exploded once more, this time with memes mocking him, videos splicing his confession with clips of courtroom dramas, and endless posts praising Richard for standing firm. In offices across the city, Blake Industries employees celebrated. Some popped champagne. Others simply breathed easier, knowing their jobs were safe. Richard, however, didn't celebrate publicly. Instead, he invited Maria to his study. She came in looking uncertain, as though she still didn't quite believe how much of this had started with her simple warning. "Maria," Richard said, standing by the window with his hands in his pockets, "I've been thinking about everything that happened these past 2 days." She nodded quietly, waiting. "You could have stayed silent," he said. "You could have decided it wasn't your place to warn me. But you didn't. You spoke up. And because of you, we stopped the disaster before it destroyed everything." Maria's throat tightened. I couldn't let it happen. You've always treated me with respect. I had to protect you." Richard's expression softened. "And you did, which is why I'm making some changes around here." He reached into his desk and handed her a sealed letter. She opened it slowly and gasped. It was a promotion, a new position, personal household manager, with double the salary, benefits for her family, and Raul's name included as a candidate for a job in Blake Industries Security Division. Maria's eyes filled with tears. "Sir, I don't know what to say." "Say yes," Richard said simply. Maria nodded, unable to stop smiling through the tears. "Yes, sir." For Richard, the victory wasn't just in beating Harrison. It was in realizing that strength didn't always mean fighting alone. Sometimes it meant listening to the quiet voices, the ones no one else paid attention to, and trusting them. And that trust had saved everything. The storm had passed. The media frenzy was slowly dying down. Harrison was behind bars, awaiting trial. Blake Industries stock had rebounded stronger than ever, soaring to record highs after investors regained faith in Richard's leadership. But inside the mansion, things were quiet, almost too quiet. Richard sat in his private library, staring into the crackling fireplace. The room smelled faintly of leather and oak, the same as it had when his father used to sit here reading contracts late into the night. For the first time in days, Richard allowed himself to feel the exhaustion that had been building inside him. He had fought a war and won, but the victory came with its own strange weight. He thought of Harrison, not as a man who tried to ruin him, but as someone who had once been his equal. They had started their businesses around the same time, had even shared a drink or two at industry galas back, when things were friendly, when had it all turned to hatred. Richard sipped the whiskey in his glass, the firelight reflecting in his tired eyes. "Sir," he looked up to see Maria standing in the doorway, hesitating as though she wasn't sure if she was disturbing him. "Come in," he said quietly. She stepped inside, her steps light, her apron neatly tied as always. I just wanted to check if you needed anything," she said softly. Richard set down the glass and gestured for her to sit. "Actually, yes. I need you to sit for a moment." Maria blinked, surprised, but obeyed. For a long moment, there was silence. Only the fire crackled between them. Then Richard spoke, his voice lower, more thoughtful than she had ever heard it. "You know, Maria," he said, "when you first came to work here, I didn't think much about who you were. To me, you were just another employee, someone who kept the house running." Maria nodded quietly, unsure where he was going with this. "But these last few days," Richard shook his head slowly, "you've shown me something most of the people I do business with never have. Courage. You risked everything to warn me, even though you could have stayed quiet and let me walk into that trap." Maria's throat tightened. "I couldn't let them hurt you. It wouldn't have been right." Richard studied her for a moment. "Why?" Maria blinked, startled by the question. "I mean it," Richard said. "Why risk so much for me? I pay you well. Yes. But loyalty like that, it doesn't just come from money." Maria took a deep breath. "Because you've always treated me like a person, sir, not just a maid. You say good morning when you see me. You thank me when I do something right. You look me in the eye when you talk to me. That might not mean much to someone like you, but it means everything to someone like me." Richard sat back, her words settling heavily in his chest. It was true. He hadn't thought much about it, but Maria was right. Most of the world ignored people like her, and yet She had been the one to save him. "Maria," he said quietly, "I think you've taught me something I forgot a long time ago." She tilted her head. "What's that, sir?" "That business isn't just about numbers or power or winning," he said. "It's about people, about trust, about knowing who stands beside you when everything falls apart." Maria's eyes glistened, but she smiled softly. "I just did what anyone should do," she said. Richard chuckled, a rare, warm sound. "If that were true, Maria, I wouldn't have been so surprised." The next few days felt different. The mansion seemed warmer, lighter somehow. Maria carried herself with a little more confidence, and Richard found himself pausing in the hallways to actually talk to her, not just about work, but about her life. He learned about Raul's dream to become a security officer, about Maria's mother, who had worked as a seamstress before falling ill, about the small house they shared in a quiet neighborhood outside the city. And for the first time in years, Richard began to feel something other than loneliness when he came home at night. One evening, as the sun was setting, Richard invited Maria to join him on the balcony overlooking the gardens. "I've been thinking," he said, leaning on the railing as the sky turned shades of pink and gold. "I spend so much time fighting battles in the boardroom that I forget there's a world outside of it, a world worth protecting." Maria glanced at him, her brow furrowing slightly. "You've helped me remember that," Richard continued, "which is why I've decided to start a new foundation, one that helps protect small businesses from corporate sabotage, just like the one Harrison tried on me." Maria's eyes widened. That's wonderful, sir." Richard smiled faintly. "And I want you involved, not just as my employee, but as someone I trust. You have good instincts, Maria, better than some of the executives I've worked with for years." Maria's breath caught. "You really mean that?" "I do," Richard said simply. Later that night, Maria called Raul, her voice trembling with excitement as she told him about everything that had happened. "Do you realize what this means?" Raul said, nearly shouting into the phone, "You changed everything, Maria. Not just for him, for us." Maria sat on the edge of her bed, tears rolling down her cheeks as she whispered, "I just wanted to do the right thing. I never imagined it would lead to all this." Meanwhile, Richard sat alone in the library once more, but this time he wasn't staring into the fire with anger or exhaustion. He was thinking about the future. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he wasn't just surviving. He was living. He raised his glass to the empty room. "To loyalty," he murmured, "and to second chances." The world outside still buzzed with news about Harrison's upcoming trial, analysts debating how long he would serve, and speculators wondering how much Blake Industries stock would rise in the coming weeks. But inside the mansion there was peace. And for Richard, that peace was the sweetest victory of all. The sun was rising over the Blake estate, painting the sky in streaks of orange and gold. For the first time in what felt like years, Richard woke up before his alarm. Not because of stress, but because he felt hopeful. Today wasn't just any day. Today marked the official launch of the Blake Foundation for Business Integrity, a project born out of the chaos of the past few weeks. Its mission was clear: to help small entrepreneurs, vulnerable business owners, and honest employees protect themselves from corporate sabotage and exploitation. But more than that, it was Richard's way of saying thank you to Maria, to Raul, to everyone who had stood by him. Instead of a cold, formal corporate event, Richard had insisted that the launch be held in the mansion's gardens. Dozens of chairs were arranged under white canopies. Fresh flowers lined the walkways, and a small stage had been built overlooking the fountain. Maria stood near the back, nervously wringing her hands in her apron. She had never attended an event like this before, not as a guest, at least. Normally she would be setting the tables or serving the drinks. But today, Richard had told her she wasn't working. "You're my guest of honor," he had said with a smile. The words had left her stunned. When the guests had gathered, journalists, business partners, government officials, even a few community leaders, Richard stepped up to the podium. He didn't wear his usual intimidating business suit. Instead, he had chosen a simple navy blazer, no tie, his shirt sleeves rolled up. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice steady but warm, "thank you for being here today. A few weeks ago, my entire world was nearly destroyed. A man I once trusted tried to ruin me, to turn my words against me, to tear down everything I had built, and I would have walked straight into his trap if it weren't for someone most people would have overlooked. Richard turned, his eyes landing on Maria. She froze, every eye in the garden suddenly on her. This woman, Richard continued, is Maria Santos. She is not just my employee. She is the reason I am standing here today. She had the courage to speak when it would have been easier to stay silent. She reminded me that integrity doesn't come from power or wealth. It comes from doing the right thing, even when it costs you. Maria's eyes welled with tears. Raul, standing proudly beside her, put an arm around her shoulders. I realized something that day, Richard said, his voice growing more emotional. We live in a world where greed and ambition often drown out honesty, where people think loyalty can be bought. But Maria proved me wrong. Loyalty is not for sale. It is earned, and I intend to spend the rest of my life earning it. The audience broke into applause, but Richard wasn't finished. That is why I am launching the Blake Foundation for Business Integrity, he said. Because no honest worker, no small business, no ordinary person should ever have to face the kind of betrayal I faced alone. After the speech, Richard called Maria onto the stage. Her legs trembled as she climbed the steps. Maria, he said, holding out a folder, this is for you? Inside was a legal document, a trust fund that would pay for Raul's college education, cover her mother's medical bills, and give her full ownership of a small home just outside the city. Maria gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Sir, I can't accept this. Yes, you can, Richard said gently, because you earned it. You saved me, Maria, and you taught me that no one gets through life alone. This is not charity. This is gratitude. By now, even some of the guests were wiping away tears. Raul hugged his mother tightly, whispering, You did it, Mama. You really did it. That night, after the guests had gone and the mansion was quiet again, Richard sat on the balcony with a glass of wine. Looking out over the gardens where the event had been held, he realized that something fundamental inside him had changed. For years, he had lived like a man at war, always fighting to stay ahead, always suspicious of others' motives, always measuring his worth in quarterly earnings and stock prices. But now, for the first time in his life, he felt like more than just a billionaire. He felt like a man with a purpose. He thought about Maria, about Raul, about the countless workers in the city whose voices were rarely heard. He thought about his father, who had always told him that wealth meant nothing if it wasn't used to make the world better. I get it now, Dad, Richard whispered into the night. I finally get it. Meanwhile, Maria sat in her modest kitchen, the trust fund folder still on the table. She had read it over 3 times, just to be sure it was real. Raul sat across from her, grinning like a child. We're going to be okay now, Mama. More than okay. Maria smiled through her tears. But deep down, what mattered most wasn't the house or the money. It was the fact that someone like Richard, someone who had everything, had looked at her, really seen her, and said, You matter. The next morning, as Richard prepared to leave for a board meeting, Maria found him by the door. Sir, she said quietly, I just wanted to say thank you. Richard smiled. Maria, I think I should be the one thanking you. No, Maria said firmly, shaking her head. You gave me more than money. You gave me respect. And that means more than anything. Richard nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. Then let's make a deal, he said. From now on, you're not just my maid. You're my advisor. Someone I can count on to tell me the truth, even when it's hard to hear. Maria's eyes widened. Then she nodded. I can do that, sir, she said. Richard smiled. I know you can. When Richard stepped into his car that morning, he felt lighter than he had in years. He realized that wealth, power, and influence meant nothing without people like Maria, the quiet heroes who kept the world running. And he silently vowed to never forget that again. Because sometimes the people we least expect, the ones in the background, the ones we take for granted, are the very ones who save us. And if we're lucky, they teach us how to save ourselves. Richard's story didn't just end with revenge against Harrison or a foundation launch. It ended with a man rediscovering his humanity, and a woman realizing her voice had the power to change everything. And maybe, just maybe, it was only the beginning of something much bigger.